The Oklahoma Commission on the Status of Women welcomes you to the panel discussion on human trafficking in Oklahoma. We will begin with our first panelist, Melissa Eick. Melissa specializes in educating the public on the complexities of human trafficking.
Some basic definitions of human trafficking and also some common misconceptions. The misconceptions that I'm going to discuss today are things that we at Dragonfly have heard over years and years of training about human trafficking nationally, working for years with survivors, and then just being out in the community and having the opportunity, a unique opportunity really, to engage in just discussions with people about this topic. So let's first look at the definition of sex trafficking. You have two different definitions depending on whether someone is an adult or a minor under the age of 18. If somebody is the age 18 or older, sex trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for commercial sex act that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. So this means that this person is compelled in some way by another person through force, and that can be various forms of violence, fraud, which is deceiving a person. So that might look like a false job offer, for example, saying, I will pay you to do this, and then you're defrauding that person. You're lying to them about that opportunity, and that allows the trafficker to then gain control over someone. Or coercion. Coercion is a real gray area, and it can look so many different ways, but some common ways that we see that in Oklahoma is something like, it's called boyfriending or girlfriending, or even just friending by a peer. So for example, creating a relationship with someone under false pretenses for the purpose of gaining control and later exploiting that person. You see that it is a little bit different when someone is a minor. So when you have a minor, all you have to show is that the person was induced to perform a commercial sex act in any way. So for example, you might not even have to have a third party that's arranging this meetup, for example. If somebody gives something of value to someone under the age of 18 to perform a commercial sex act, then that person is committing human trafficking. The type of elements that you have to prove for sex trafficking with a minor are far fewer. And then for labor trafficking, this definition applies to someone who is a minor or an adult. The recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So you see these similar elements of force, fraud, or coercion, and those, they can look all sorts of different ways, but the examples I gave can apply to labor trafficking as well. And I think that it's really important to note that sex trafficking gets more of a spotlight in Oklahoma and in our country, but labor trafficking is a big problem here too. This happens in a variety of different ways in Oklahoma, so it's important to know that service providers are seeing both, that law enforcement is seeing both. Now I'm just going to briefly go through a few common misconceptions about human trafficking. One is that human trafficking victim survivors are all foreign nationals. It's so easy to see human trafficking as a problem that doesn't happen here. It's easy to think of it as something that happens far away, that doesn't happen to American citizens. But that really is not the case. For example, at Dragonfly, we've served a number of people who are foreign nationals who were brought to the United States to be exploited. But the majority of people who we serve are from Oklahoma, or their trafficking experience was in Oklahoma. I think it's surprising to know how many people we have served who were born and raised and trafficked in their hometown. It makes it a lot closer. It makes you realize that you could be passing by people who are trafficking victim survivors every day. It could be happening in your neighborhood, and it makes it a little bit scarier to realize how close it can be. Another common misconception is that trafficking requires movement of some kind. You see the word traffic and you think of like traffic, like cars and movement, and there's a lot of rhetoric about transporting people for human trafficking. But in fact, like the movement, I mean, you just saw the definitions of human trafficking, and movement to another location is not required at all. Consider the case of a very tragic case of a parent who traffics their child. That child may never leave their home, and yet their parent is able to commercially exploit them. Another common misconception is that trafficking victim survivors are all women and girls. We commonly see in the media and in discussions about human trafficking, images that we see on social media, that it's typically women and girls who are exploited. And for sure, a large number of trafficking victim survivors are women and girls, but it's also really important to remember that men and boys can be exploited. I think especially when you consider labor trafficking. And it's really, I think what's so important about this is if we only think that trafficking happens to women or girls, then we overlook a whole population of people. So it's critical to understand that this can happen to anyone. And similarly, there's a common misconception that trafficking victim survivors are all children. Again, you just saw in those definitions that we looked at that adults can absolutely be victims of this crime. And similarly, if we're working with someone who is over the age of 18 and we think, well, they're not a child, so they can't possibly have been exploited in this way, we're missing out on an important point of intervention in that person's life where we can provide services and help them walk toward freedom. Another common misconception is that traffickers are always strangers, not someone who the victim knows. So this is important because it is not uncommon for traffickers to be friends, schoolmates, classmates, family members. Like I mentioned, we've seen parents who were someone's very first trafficker, a grandparent, an aunt or an uncle, sometimes siblings even. But then you also have the case of intimate partners. You have a husband who traffics his wife, and we have to have our eyes opened to that possibility as well. And then this is related. You may have seen on social media stories that tend to really spread like wildfire, that someone was abducted out of a big box parking lot and put into human trafficking. We're not going to discount the possibility of that happening. Of course, it can happen, but actually traffickers tend to be way more insidious and strategic than that. Kidnapping someone from a parking lot is a pretty risky move, but reaching out to somebody on social media, commenting on someone's photos that they're so beautiful, getting an entry point, expressing interest in someone's life, and then building a false relationship of trust is way more effective, because then you can possibly get that person to go with you willingly. Another common misconception we hear a lot in Oklahoma, and this rhetoric has been around for a long time, is that the highway system is the largest factor in determining a state's vulnerability to human trafficking. So you hear people here talk a lot about the intersection of I-35 and I-40, and so that makes our state more vulnerable to human trafficking. But what we've learned is that almost every state in the country says the same thing about their highway systems, that, oh, this isn't a problem that's happening in our state. This is something that's coming in from somewhere else. But I think that you can probably see the danger in believing that way. Again, it can cause us to miss the person who was born and raised and sold right here in Oklahoma. So consider things like the high poverty rate, substance abuse rates, child abuse, domestic violence, you name it. You're probably familiar with the different challenges that our state faces. Those all create vulnerable situations, someone in need that traffickers can reach out to and offer to fulfill a need. And once they do that, that kind of provides an entry point into someone's life where they can start to gain control over that person. And then the last thing I'm going to mention just briefly, we'll be talking about it more today, is that statistics related to trafficking are well known and they're easy to gather in Oklahoma. In fact, human trafficking is such a covert crime and underreported. And so it actually can make information and like hard numbers, hard statistics, pretty difficult to gather.